Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome back if you've joined us for previous talks, or welcome if this is your first time joining us for the speaker series on diversity dynamics and crises in paleontology. Before we begin, please take a look at our code of conduct to make sure this event runs as smoothly as possible. And I'm absolutely delighted to announce today's speaker, Dr. Devapriya Chattopadhyay. So Devapriya is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Earth and Climate Science in the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune, India. Devapriya's research interests include fossil predator-prey dynamics, the effect of regional environmental factors on marine molluscan diversity and distribution, and the paleoenvironment of Western India during the Oligocene to early Miocene, a time of important regional and global events. But today, Devapriya is joining us to talk more broadly about Indian paleontology in a talk entitled Paleontological Research in India, the Colonial Past Shapes the Present and Dictates the Future. Pass it over to you, Devapriya. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Emma, for such a nice introduction. Let me just share my screen. So I hope that it's visible now.
It's perfect.
Okay. So, hello everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I think it's a great platform where all of us can come and share our views and talk about some of the real problems, although generally they are often neglected in the academic setting. So this talk is going to be about something about my research, but more importantly, how I address the questions and some of the issues that I faced. And some of them are quite non-academic in nature, but eventually that's what guides the final output in terms of the research, in terms of our understanding. So hopefully we will try to get a different perspective at the end of the lecture and figure out at least some ways how to deal with some of these issues. So in order to put a perspective, this talk is not completely about the entire history of India or Indian paleontology. It's more about my personal perspective based on my work in India and abroad and as a paleontologist. So to start with, let me just give you a quick recap of what I'm interested in and what my research is all about. So I'm a paleoecologist and I'm primarily interested in nature of faunal response to biological and physical triggers in ancient and recent marine ecosystem. And it's a broad theme. The primary focus out of these where I concentrate most of my time and energy is to understand the history of biotic interaction and its evolutionary impact. The other question that I'm also interested in is the Cenozoic paleoclimate, paleogeography, and its impact on the tropical fauna. Now, we use different kinds of techniques, including the fossils from the field, living communities, studying living communities using underwater observations, and the model system that we use to conduct lab experiments in the aquarium are primarily mollusks, and in certain cases, gyrophagous predators such as crabs. And finally, all of these things together, using all of these data, we try to understand the natural system and how it changed over time using statistical analysis. So just a glimpse that most of my work starts with a neontological experiment in a synthetic saltwater setting. Then I try to incorporate ecological observation, and then finally use those to construct a testable hypothesis, which I finally try to test using the fossil record. In each of these steps, we lose some of the resolution, but at the same time, we include natural variability in a more detailed way. And once everything is done, those fossil records finally need to be curated and put together in a repository. So that's the general framework. Now, it may seem very simple, and we will see what are the hurdles, some of the hurdles that I faced. But before we go into that, it's important also to understand or what my interest is in terms of India, not just because I am from India, but some of the aspects that we can use Indian collection for. So one of the questions that I'm interested in is the effect of seaway configuration on the overall diversity and paleogeography of organisms. And often I try to understand it by focusing on areas or times when the seaway configuration changed. One of such area is the Mediterranean and Red Sea connection, where because of the Suez Canal, the seaway opened. And one of the questions that we were addressing was that what happens when you actually connect two seaways after a long time when they were separated? What's the change you can expect in the ecological community? So that we can do using the recent record of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. But a similar question can be addressed in a slightly different way, that what happens if you close the seaway? And this question leads us to the place close to my home, and that is the area near India. So right now, the seaway that you find here, or the water body that you find here, which is known as Arabian Sea, is no longer connected to the Mediterranean. However, if we go back in time during Miocene, before Miocene, this was a continuous seaway. The Tethyan province actually extended all the way to Mediterranean. And right around 19 million years ago, because of a change in the tectonic configuration, this seaway closed. So if we want to know what happens to the behavior or the overall ecology of shallow marine groups because of a closure of seaway, this is an ideal area. There are other features which also makes India interesting, or the Indian subcontinent interesting, geologically as well as paleontologically, because this is also a time when the seaway closure happened around Miocene, and this is also a time when one of the major mountain ranges developed right around this area. And because of this high mountain range, the rivers, which were not there before, started moving, and they carried a lot of terrestrial sediments into the seawater, and the overall seawater chemistry also changes. So anyone interested in knowing how the change in seawater chemistry affects the shallow marine groups, this is also the perfect time and the perfect spot to look into. So rise of Himalayas, Tethyan closure, all of these can be studied using the shallow marine groups as well as other marine groups right around this place. The third question that is globally interesting is the shift of marine biodiversity hotspot. So one idea is that marine biodiversity, right now we see a hotspot in the Coral Triangle in the Southeast Asia, but again, before Miocene, we find them more in the Mediterranean region. Exactly how did they move, and do we find something in between, or how was the hotspot like, biodiversity hotspot like in the time between Miocene, Oligocene till recent? Again, one of the key pieces is around Indian subcontinent, especially the western part of Indian subcontinent. And finally, this is also a time of major climatic fluctuation. And very our understanding of response to climatic fluctuation is primarily limited or dominated by the data from temperate region. The understanding from tropical region still needs more data. And again, this could be a nice place to fill this gap. With all of these questions and with all of these promises of addressing a large question, I started working on the shallow marine communities, the fossilized shallow marine communities from the western coast of India. And that took me to this tiny little spot. It's called the Kutch Basin. And I did regular field excursion to Kutch for over 10 years now. And every year I learned something, but it also made me aware of the other things that play often a bigger role in understanding the actual biodiversity pattern when we are diving deep into the record. So to have a general sense, we targeted the oligomycin areas or oligomycin formations of this Kutch, and we documented various parts of this entire formation. And our primary aim was to collect as much fossil as possible and then to have a general understanding of the responses. Because as a quantitative paleoecologist, numbers is of highest priority. So unless we have a large enough collection, it's not possible to address many of the questions and to satisfy the reviewers. And that's where I hit the first roadblock. So the study of Kutch mollusks and all kinds of invertebrates, and in fact vertebrates also, dates back to 1840, started with British paleontologists, and it includes stalwarts like Sorby, Vredenberg, Eames. Everybody was interested in knowing the overall molluscan ecology as well as overall invertebrate ecology from this tiny spot called Kutch because of its high diversity and very well preserved fauna. But then when I started to look for the original collection, I realized that those collections are scattered all over the world. A significant portion of it is in England. Some other parts are in France, in Austria. There are some things which are already in India in some repositories, but that's not so easy to access. So that's when my interest also started to include not so conventional approaches of looking at paleontological data and to understand what are some of the biases that can creep in, which are always influencing the fossil data and our understanding. So my general interest about the history of fossil data after its discovery probably started around this time. And in order to understand why Indian fossils are scattered all over the world and not much in India, and why it's so hard to actually access Indian fossils, it's important to take a look at the human history. So the history of colonialism in India is quite old, and it started with the Portuguese settlement around 1500, and then followed by Dutch settlement, followed by England, but it was still under the name of East India Company, which started in 1612, followed by Danish settlement in 1618, then French settlement in 1668, and finally, from 1857, it was completely taken over by the British colonial power. So there was a slight difference between this East India Company and then when it went to the monarch. And this is the general time from 1857 to 1947, which is generally called the British India. But for Indians, it really did not matter in terms of the handover from the East India Company to British India. So the entire period from 1612 to 1947 is generally called time of British Raj, Raj being the word for the king. So if you take a look at the map of India around 1498 to 1739, you will see all kinds of Western presence in all around India, and everybody had their own culture and own financial interest because of which they colonized. So the Indian society also changed, but at the same time, the economy changed significantly, and we are going to see more of it in next few minutes. So how was the British rule in India, and what was the Indian perspective on this British rule? So I think one word captures it very nicely, and this is not a word that's described by me or somebody else. It's the first Indian word which made its place in the British or English vocabulary. So the first Indian word that entered the British dictionary or English dictionary is loot, L-O-O-T, and it means plunder. And the same word in India means the same thing. It's basically to plunder. And I think it captures the general sense of what British rule was to start with, and it continued. So to start with, as I said, it started with a company. It's called East India Company. And this was one of the efficient corporates, which in its prime time, it was governed by only 35 members and had a very small office in London, but it actually ruled over millions. And there are historic arguments about whether it was good, whether it was bad, but finally the takeover from East India Company to transfer of power to the British Parliament was one way of establishing more control over India, and also to increase the profits, and it should go directly to the British government rather than going through a corporate. So that was at least arguably one of the reasons for it. But how did it actually affect? And the times during this and what was the effect on Indian commoners was very nicely described by William Dalrymple, who's a historian in anarchy and exactly how this corporation ruled India. So it was an interesting period to read about. But I'm not so sure whether it was the best period to live, especially as an Indian. Now, again, this was also the time where India got a lot of investment in terms of contribution to towards transportation, education, and judiciary. And many of the arguments for the British rule and how beneficial it was for India comes from those facts that it actually improved the transportation, education, and judiciary. But it's slightly controversial simply because the primary investment for all of these things were actually coming from Indian farmers and the GDP of India, and then finally getting channelized to these portions or these sectors to improve connection between different colonies and to increase major support in terms of food, in terms of ration, often to keep the military settlement better. But as part of it, as part of this increasing education and judiciary, part of these British royalty and some of these some of the people of the settlement started a new movement, and part of it created this Asiatic Society Museum. And that happened in 1814. Then it changed its name to Imperial Museum, and finally it's known as Indian Museum. Now, this was a center for art, archaeology, anthropology, zoology, geology, and botany to showcase what are the different aspects of Indian culture and heritage. So although it had a number of fossils in it, the primary focus was to show the Indian heritage and under the colonial rule. So it still is there, but it's an ancient repository. So it really did not improve in time in terms of adopting to the new repository practices or new curatorial practices. On top of it, during Second World War, it was also used as the cantonment of British soldiers, and parts of it is completely ruined, and many of the fossils were lost because of that, without any record. The other problem during this time was the economic decline. So I'll simply say one part of it. So this green portion is the east part of India, which now belongs to Bangladesh as well as West Bengal state in India. And this was known to be the best place to be in simply because of its higher production in terms of crops, in terms of all kinds of fabric and architectural work. So it was known to be the province with highest GDP across the world. And it changed during this entire rule. It actually gone through two phases of famines. So the first Bengal famine of 1769 to 70, it was under the East India Company rule, and it caused like 1 million deaths. And again, it's from a spot which had the maximum crop production, maximum food crop production. The second thing didn't change even with the transfer of power from the corporate to the parliament. The second Bengal famine came in 1942 under British Empire, and it caused 3 million deaths. And it's one of the most well-documented famines. And one of the person working on this, who also went and won a Nobel Prize in economics, was Amartya Sen. And he documented and demonstrated that these famines were not because of food crop failure. It's primarily because of the gap in the supply and the demand, and more importantly, in terms of the priorities of where the food should be supplied, where it should be rationed, and those priorities ties into the idea of Second World War and food reserve and how much should go to the for a military ration. Now, why is it important when we talk about museums and fossils? This was one of the major ideas to revert after India got independence. One of the major priority was that we should not have another famine. So the time after post-independence, when all the other countries already had museums and they were investing heavily into the development of science, development of collections, development of research, India couldn't afford to do that, and the highest priority went into food security, massive development in technology, agricultural revolution, and all kinds of infrastructural renovation. And when I went to Kutch in 2010, so many years after independence, I still was a part of these changes. So the first time we went, we found localities with fantastic fossil preservation. Next time we went, it was converted to a dam. This is one of the spots in Western India which has a major crisis of water. And one of the quick fix of these water crises was to build dams. And there was no priority for preserving the places with fossil heritage. The same thing happened with infrastructural development. Again, cement factories covered most of the limestone outcrops, which yielded fossils. Again, within spans of 10 years, 20 years. This was again one of the nice Eocene outcrops full of forams, And next time we went, this highway, this overbridge, extended, converting the entire area to roads. Again, something which is very difficult to defend when we are talking about food shortage or education. Fossils always take a backseat. Agricultural renovation and agricultural revolution. So many of these places where you see these fields, probably a few years ago or tens of years ago, it was actually outcrops. They have fossil reported, but often when we go now, it's completely covered with these nice fields, but it's very hard to access the fossils. So what's the status of the overall fossil wealth of India? So if you look at the geologic map, in terms of the rocks, it has quite a good exposure of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic and a nice exposure of Cenozoic. But then when we take a look at its representation based on PaleoDB, the entire Indian record, according to PaleoDB, represents only 0.9% of the global record. If we break it down in terms of the different groups, we find that the vertebrates constitute 0.6% of the global record. Mollusks constitute 1.3% of the global record. And very interestingly, plants constitute 1.7% of the global record. And this again has something to do with one of the major emphasis in India to find out coal and coal mines, and those are often associated with very good plant fossil preservation. So it's slightly higher than many of the other fossil taxa. At this point, the collections are scattered around India, and also it's in different places, and these different places have collections, but these collections are not integrated. A few places with a very long history of collections are Birbal Sahani Institute of Paleosciences. This is named after a famous paleobotanist, Birbal Sahani. And again, that explains that India actually had sort of a culture of paleobotany for a very long time, and that probably reflects in the overall increase in the percentage of plant taxa reported from India. And then there is Himalayan Geology, Geological Survey of India, Indian Museum, and Bombay Natural History Society. But when we take a perspective of other natural history museums, it's very depressing simply because we are still at a point where we are trying to integrate collections. We are still collecting things from the field because often the repatriation of the fossils is not possible. And while the other natural history museums have completed their initial structure of even databasing before 1980s, we are still in that building phase. So there is no way it's kind of in the same place. And as a paleoecologist, when I'm trying to do things in India, it's hugely disadvantageous simply because we are not in the same plane. I'm just going to quickly touch upon some of these specific problems about collections, community logistics, and funding. And then I'll try to answer some of these questions. So we still find ourselves in the field taking one fossil at a time. And the major problems that I could identify from my experience is one of them is the collection. So we do not have collections that are well databased, and therefore it's easy to search. Second problem is that personal collection of academicians that has no way, those are generally not well preserved, especially after the academician retires. Those are the orphan collections. Often it's thrown away or just boxed up in a tiny dingy place which nobody has any information about. There is a lack of regulation preserving fossil sites. There is no central repository and no National Museum of Natural History. There are fragmented collections in local repositories, and it's very hard to search them. But the most important thing is many of the Indian collections are housed in other countries, and it's extremely difficult to access them. I'll again elaborate on it in next few minutes, why that is. And then the other problem is the illegal fossil sale and poaching of the fossils. There was a recent update on dinosaur eggs being sold at a very high price. So unless the legislation takes place and awareness is there, it's very hard to stop all of these things. Community plays an important role. Unfortunately, the paleontologist community is very small in India. The community size varies significantly between groups focusing on a fossil group. So vertebrates have a slightly larger community depending on which group you are working on. Microfossils have slightly larger communities simply because it has a very applied aspect going to energy industries. Paleobotanists have a heritage because of Dr. Sahani, Ruben Sahani, and the previous historic figures. When we come to invertebrate paleontology, the group is very small. If you think about paleobiologists, even smaller. We do not have any representation of earth science in general in school curriculum, and that makes a big difference. Very few colleges offer degree program in geology. And finally, the undergraduate and graduate curriculum in geology and earth sciences often has minimal emphasis on paleontology. So many people do not even, although they are geology graduates, they have no interest or understanding in paleontology, and they don't even pursue it. As a result, the entire community is shrinking. And most importantly, there are new age institutes which are coming up in India for last 20 years or 30 years. And in various aspects, they can compete with the world-renowned institutes all over the world. However, they have very few positions for paleontologists. Logistics is a big issue, and colonial past makes it even more difficult. It shaped the geopolitics of Indian subcontinent, and it's not conducive to conduct field trips across the border. So you might be familiar with the tension between India and Pakistan. And in order to do a field trip in Pakistan, it's almost impossible for an Indian national. And very interestingly, it's quite okay for people from any other country to go and do the field trip in other parts, in Indian subcontinent. So it's not just a place of conflict, it's also something that developed over the years, and many times it developed because of the colonial past. The second point is that the Indian funding agencies are reluctant to fund field trips and travels outside India, and therefore it becomes almost impossible to access the fossils which are housed outside India. International funding agencies, on the other hand, often require participants from countries of Western Europe and USA. So using international funds often become difficult unless you have a collaborator in those countries. When we try to approach natural history museums all across the world for loans, it's often turned down for legitimate reasons, because often the fossils are not returned, but because of probably fault of one person, it's generalized, and it's a general thing that we do not get a very warm welcome when we send loan requests. And apart from that, issues to access publication, especially old monographs, become another issue. many of these museums, the old museums all across the globe, they have the collection of old monographs published from India during colonial times, but India doesn't have the record of it. So those are the issues which contribute to make it even more complex. And with all these restrictions, addressing a global question becomes almost impossible. So it becomes a very locally interesting question that we can address. Any kind of regional survey or global survey requires all of these issues to be taken care of. I put this picture just to give a sense that many of the international audience have this general sense that India is a very conservative country. Well, there are parts of India and Indian who are conservative, but this picture actually depicts something very different. It's not just a bunch of happy people, excited about a particular function or an event. They are celebrating the Mars mission. So they are breaking the glass ceiling. It's all women scientists who were the lead of the Mars mission of India, but it also shows something about the focus and funding. So the new focus of Indian funding agencies is for the technological advancement. I think it's one thing that is always there for the countries which had a colonial past. They want to be the forerunners in the technological development. But at the same time, that means that Indian funding agencies are extremely reluctant to fund things such as collection, because for them, collection, museum, paleontology is the science of past century. So we missed the boat, and we are in a situation, we are in a time when that is absolutely essential to progress for paleontology, but that's not the priority for national bodies in terms of funding. Because in the international forum, it's a given that a country, if they have fossils, they will have a good repository. It's unlikely that they don't have. So you don't come to the news headlines by making a repository, but you come to headlines by launching a settlement. And finally, which is extremely important, is the colonial legacy and mistrust. So this is a picture, I think, it's a symbolic picture which shows a British officer surveying India. And this hierarchy was very much there. And this historic tradition of hierarchical research practices in field visit-based research is there, it was there. You are familiar with Mount Everest, and the thing that's not so familiar is George Everest, after whose name the mountain was named, had nothing to do with this particular mountain. So it was actually measured by one of the surveyors, Walker, and then it was actually measured by an Indian called, his name was Radhanath Shidda. But it was just a way of showing it's a patronage to the highest ranked official, George Everest, because of which this name was given, without any even mention that why it was given to this particular person, or without using the local name. And this tradition actually created a very complicated environment of mistrust. So even now, there is a very strong reluctance of the funding agencies to fund collaborative research, and the contribution towards international collaborations are generally undervalued. It's always thought that it must be that the international collaborators are treating the Indian counterpart as just the people who are going to show the spots, and that's about it. And therefore, only the established scientists engage in international collaboration because they can take the risk. The young researchers are not at all encouraged. And in fact, many a times, these collaborative works and the publication out of these collaborative works are not even considered for promotion and hiring. So these are making it extremely difficult place to do research, and unless we change it altogether. So people have started writing about it and saving the fossil heritage site moving forward for a very long time. So there were articles in 2010, 12, 13, 17, and finally 18 in various platforms, including Science and Nature, letters to the editor or news articles about this requirement. And there are changes. So for example, the Initiative for Regional Repository, the Indian Museum of the Earth, it's in its planning phase. So probably in a few years, we are going to get it. There are changes in legislation, and there is a proposed bill for increased monitoring of the fossil areas, fossil parks. There are development of fossil parks, Dinosaur Fossil Park and Museum in Airoli. But there requires to be a more increased awareness at an international scale. And I'm thankful to the lead in this paper, both Nusaiba and Emma, where it was a collaborative work to bring into notice that it's not just a problem of India, and it's not India who is losing it for not opening up. It's also the international paleontological community who will lose because the overall understanding of deep diversity in the deep time will be completely tainted if we selectively take fossils from areas which are easily accessible and are better represented in terms of their economy and their cultural history and their past. So I think unless we have a very strong sense that this loss is actually a loss in terms of science, we are never going to achieve this international collaboration and finally to recoup the gaps that are typical to the countries which had colonial past. And unless we do that, we are always going to have a half picture or probably a tainted picture of what was the past like in terms of biodiversity. So I don't mean to say that I have all the answers or I could present all the problems, but I definitely hope that I wish more attention is paid to Indian fossil assemblages and the Indian paleontology, just because without it, the overall understanding of paleontology is not going to be complete, and we will end up with a biased picture. And there is a long list of acknowledgement. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any of the questions.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk and covering so many different things as well. So thank you so much for shoving that all in there. Everybody who's in the chat at the moment, you can drop your questions into either the chat or the Q&A box, and we can ask them to Devapriya. While people are scrambling to get their questions written, I had a thought actually as you were speaking about funding, and I remember you did your PhD and you worked for a while in the US. Was it the case that you might have had greater access to Indian fossils while an Indian in the US than you do now being based in India? Because that's a crazy thought, if that's true. Did you get a sense of that?
Well, well, there are different things. So for example, one of the major, indirectly, yes, because when I was in the US, any grant that came, it didn't restrict me to go to any places in the world. So that automatically gives me this freedom of accessing any collection wherever in the world it is. The second thing is slightly different, but I think I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to it. for my own sanity, and that is I had a very different response from editors and often reviewers when I submitted papers from the US versus after coming back from India. I would regularly get comments about the quality of English, which I don't think changes within a year of leaving US. But I got that a lot when the affiliation changed. I'm not saying that it makes a big difference in terms of the publication, but these small things might add up. If the probability of a person of a manuscript getting accepted reduces, then probably the visibility in terms of PaleoDB or anywhere, it also goes down. So finally affecting the overall representation. So I think there are a lot of small social nuances that are there, which are difficult to quantify.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is a really important thing to mention, actually. Yeah. I've had a question on if you, based on your personal experiences, of course, and I know you can't speak to the whole of paleontology, but what do you think that foreign museums could do to help in terms of access to fossils from India, in terms of scans or digital methods and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that can be done is, making very high grade digital pictures. Probably another way of doing it is, again, I'm sure that it doesn't work as well as the physical specimen, but in terms of loaning, it can be a 3D printed one. At least that's the next best thing. If a museum cannot afford to send the real specimen, even if you send a 3D printed one, it's the next best thing. It's better than completely, rejecting the request altogether. The other thing that I think is to have even smaller programs just to cover the cost of movement. Okay, that makes a big difference, because that's, again, as I'm saying, that probably it has a higher chance of getting funded if I ask for a very fancy instrument, but I would not get money for traveling abroad, even if it's a very small quantum of money. So I think these are things that especially museums in the West may think about, that finally these kind of collaborations would contribute to the uh, overall knowledge of paleontology. It's not just India will get better. I think that's one idea we should come out of, that it's, the countries with colonial past, there is no way you can compensate for it. The entire direction about collaboration, about mutual respect and research, collaborative research, is to ensure that we don't get a tainted picture in terms of the science, in terms of our understanding of the deep past.
Great, thank you for that. This might be the last question given time, but are these issues spoken about widely within the Indian paleontological community? Do people have relatively similar opinions on this, or is there a widespread?
As I said, that there are many of these issues which have been spoken about, and there is a series of newspaper articles and interviews where people have raised this issue. But at the same time, it's important to understand that I think this works in many of the countries, that the funding agencies, they are not dominated by paleontologists. They are not even dominated by earth scientists. So the policies, the science policies, are not always in the best interest of paleontologists or earth scientists. So I think that's one of the reasons of this sort of a disconnect between what we need and what's being implemented. least one of them is.
Great, thank you. I've got a question in the chat that actually might be quite a positive one to end on. What actions, in your opinion, would encourage more people to take up paleontology as a career in India?
I guess one of the which works universally is to creation of jobs, and even if it's like smaller things. And you see, it's a continuous process. If you have a museum, if you have multiple museums, you need curators, you need collection managers, you need volunteers. So the entire thing changes. And if I try to calculate, okay, what would be the benefit out of it, probably we wouldn't see it right now, but 10 years down the line and 20 years down the line, it will change the scenario. I think there is another question. Do you have issues?
You're right. Do you have issues regarding access to software that prohibits you from publishing or doing analytical methods?
It would be hard to comment for me because I stick to the open license things so that I don't have this trouble. I actively look for it. But yes, that's also an issue. And as I said, that more than the software, I think the library access becomes a big deal because it's a very expensive one. And many of these central institutes in India, they can afford to do it. But think about smaller colleges where one individual is trying to carry out research. For them, it's almost zero access to publications, to library. So those are the things that maybe we can think of how to make it more open and more inclusive.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for those influx of questions towards the end. And thank you so much, Devapriya, for taking the time to present this wonderful talk to us today. We're absolutely delighted to host you. I will end by speaking a little bit about the next speaker who will be joining us on Friday at 4 p.m. UTC or GMT. And that's Aline Giraldi, who will be speaking about perspectives from Brazil.